Namaskar. Ethics in the History of Western Philosophy. As Sir David Roos points out in a classical work, Foundation of Ethics, written over 60 years ago, there are, broadly speaking, two approaches to ethics. This is better known as the distinction between deontological and teleological ethics. The Greek word for an end in the sense of a goal to be achieved is telos. Hence, teleological ethics comprises all those kind of ethics which see the uh, criterion of morality in terms of whether an action fulfills the overall total end of human life in general and of moral activity in particular. The word deontological was coined by British moralist Jeremy Bentham from the Greek word "deon", literally that which is binding. Deontological ethics views the morally good in terms of doing one's duty. Deontology would be the science of moral duties. We shall see that these two approaches differ more in emphasis than anything else. They are not mutually exclusive, watertight compartments. Introduction. Let us start with the teleological approach. Ever since Aristotle, practically the entire Western tradition of philosophizing has accepted his contradiction that the ultimate human end is happiness. Now, this could be understood as either exclusively or with a strong stress on individual or private happiness. This in turn can be understood in two further ways as pleasure, but not in the narrow, crude sense that the term usually implies. In which case we have the school hedonistic ethics, or it can be seen as self-realization, and this is the eudaimonic approach. The other alternative is to see happiness more from the standpoint of others or of the community. Thus, the utilitarian ethics may once again be looked at from a personal or a social dimension. Summarizing all this in a convenient diagram, we can represent it thus: teleological ethics, uh, hedonistic, Epicurus, Hobbes, ethical egoism, eudaimonia, Aristotle. Second, personal utilitarian, Bentham, social utilitarianism, Mill. Deontological approach comprises a rather heterogeneous group of people whose sole title in common is that they look upon moral actions from the point of view of duty or obligation. In other words, is it is the morally right rather than morally good which is their concern. The key question for them then is why the morally right should be so. In other words, what makes duty a duty. Some of the prominent philosophers of deontologically are are Occam, Dur- Durkheim, Kant, and Aquinas. Epicurus, Sir, Circa 4th century BCE. Epicurus sought to eliminate all unpleasant feelings like fear and anxiety from the contemporary psyche and promote emotions of well-being, harmony, and pleasure. Not surprisingly, he summoned his followers to meet in a beautiful garden. Epicureanism is thus sometimes called the philosophy of the garden and seek after pleasure. This was not the base wine, woman, and song kind of thing that the English word Epicurean now implies, but the appreciation of the nobler and higher refinements of life, such as friendship, art, music, and the like. Moreover, he stressed the quest not for the for the fleeting, transitory thing, but that pleasure which might last for a lifetime. In other words, absence of pain and serenity of mind. Greek atarsia rather than pleasure gratification was this aim. Now, atarsia was to be short. First of all, by removal of all false fears, such as the fear of death and the fear of gods. Such fear, like all vices, were not conductive to a atarsia. Indeed, he saw the highest virtue of all to be phronesis, dis, discer, discernment, the ability to size up and estimate the quality and lastingness of pleasure and pain enshrined in various possible actions, so as to maintain a life in the best possible state of atarsia. Which is what is relevant for us is Epicurus' insight is that the criterion of morality is conductiveness of our human final end. Aristotle, 4th century BCE. Aristotle's ethics begin with the observation that all being seek their perfection. Humans are no exception to this universal principle, and indeed happiness is really to be founded in the attainment of human perfection or self-realization. He then goes on to distinguish between two kinds of human action that can help us attain authentic happiness, and those are the moral and intellectual virtues. Virtue is defined as a habitual state or disposition of the soul, and is well known for his dictum that virtue is the golden mean between two extremes. Thus, courage is the midpoint between the voices of excess or of fool, foolhardiness, and the voice of the minimal cowardice. He gives pride of place and space to the five intellectual virtues: practical knowledge, technique, prudence, phronesis, uh, uh, ratiocination of the ability to make arguments and proofs thanks to logic, episteme, intuitive insight, nous, and wisdom, Sophia. The highest and noblest of them all. It is wisdom which enables us to attain the true happiness, which is our last end. It is clear that his is a teleological ethics par excellence. The guiding motive in it all is not law or obligation, but what is conductive to one's end. In other words, for Aristotle, more rightness or wrongness is seen more in terms of the good consciously intended by the human agent. Thus, moral badness is linked to ignorance in the sense that no one seeks evil knowingly and willingly, as such Thomas Aquinas 1224 to 1274. Thomas Aquinas was arguably a great Catholic luminary of the Middle Ages. This Dominican monk, basing his moral philosophy on the teleological eudaimonia of Aristotle, states God as the ultimate and or supreme good of humans, as indeed of all being. His Christian convictions, however, led him to ever that only with the help of God's grace a free supernatural gift could be attain our fullest encounter with our last end in the next life. God has a plan for all creation, not a kind of fatalistically predetermined one, but rather a vision of creative development enshrined in the dynamism of every being and directing it to its full flowering. In other words, God's eternal law for all being is manifest in the natural law, inbuilt into their own natures or essences. This natural law is accessible to human partly through revelation and partly through human reason. The norm of morality for Aquinas then is ultimately God's eternal law or eternal reason, but more proximately It is human reason which can work out its implications by critically reflecting on what the natural law entails, that which is in conformity with the demand of the natural law, as discovered partly by the right use of human reason, is morally good, that which is not is morally bad. Obviously, for Aquinas, the norm of morality, natural law, is intrinsic to the human act and not an extrinsic command or anything else outside of it. Aquinas, inspired by Aristotle, distinguished between speculative and practical reason. The former had to do with theoretical knowledge, the latter with issue of a more practical import, action, more precisely, more conduct. Furthermore, each of these could be subdivided into a more di- discursive or argumentative part, ratio, rationality, and a more intuitive aspects, intellectus. The intuitive part of speculative reason furnishes a ratio with those basic first principle is calls upon to carry out its reasoning process. The principle of identity and contradiction. These truths are self-evident and do not require any proof. Indeed, as first principle, they cannot be proved, but are the implicit propositions of all arguments and proofs used by ratio. In the same way, there are also some self-evident first principles of practical reason called synderesis, such as do good and avoid evil. Aquinas calls them the first principle of natural law. The above mentioned example is of course relevant to morals. By synderesis also has its bearing in other spheres of activity. Aquinas adds some illustrations. For instance, there are those which we humans share with all beings. The principle of self-preservation is one such. Then there are those we share with animals. Procreation or reproduction is one of the most important of those. Then there are those which are proper to human alone. Beside the moral one quoted above, there are also similar obligations such as the need to live in society and to get to know about God. These as well shall see should not be identified with what we call conscience. From these first principles, which generally speaking are universal and unchanging, we derive secondary and more specific one, which though also of universal and unchanging import, at least technologically, are susceptible to change on adoption in particular concrete cases. Thus, the secondary principle, which directs one to always tell the truth and never utter falsehood, may be relaxed when the unjust aggressor asks one to tell him where his father is hiding. This is furthermore now Aquinas explains how there appears to be variance among the moral practices of people. It is due to wrong arguments from the first principles. Thus, unknown to certain people, they accepted some preservations and corrupt practices as ethically sound. Finally, we cannot omit mention of Aquinas. Rather, through treatment of the virtues, among which we must draw attention to prudence, which safeguards Thomistic ethics from the pitfalls of legalism and inflexibility. William of Ockham, this medieval this medieval Franciscan friar and inveterate enemy of Thomism, is the person mainly responsible for having established a deep-rooted empirical trend into British philosophy, a heritage that would be called upon and developed by Locke, Berkeley, and Hume some 500 years later as a counterblast to the intellectualism of Aquinas. He championed voluntarism. Occam appears to be concerned with upholding God's freedom and omnipotence. as he understood it at all cost. Thus, he refused to recognize the wrongness of human acts as stemming from any inherent quality in themselves, but wholly and entirely from a free decision of God whose omnipotence was absolute, being restricted only by what would be logically contradictory. Why Occam seems to confuse the whole issue by Occam seems to confuse the whole issue by giving a place to both God's ordered power as well as right reason. The former refers to God's free decision, whereby He has established the actual moral order, opting to make certain actions right and others wrong. He would hardly make a general change in this matter. All this seems to conflict with his other notion, which says that a morally good act should also be in conformity with the right reason. Indeed, he goes along with the common medieval assumptions that a person is obliged to follow what, according to his sincere conviction, is in conformity with it, even if he was in error. But this last idea seems to do more credit to Occam's head than his heart. For if he thereby opened up the possibility for a person who does not accept divine revelation, how else except through divine revelation could we come to know what is right and what is wrong? Since God freely decides this, yet there seems to be a certain contradiction here. If right reason can somehow account for moral rightness, then it is not quite dependent exclusively on God's free choice. Thomas Hobbes, in this classic book, Leviathan, named after the gigantic monster mentioned in the book of Genesis and which was in image of the all-powerful state, Hobbes gave up his description of man in the free state of nature, that is, before humans band together to set up social structures and institutions. In a word, life was sheep hell in those times. Man behaved unto men like a ferocious wild beast, Homo homini lupus. Indeed, that is why human established the state is its primary aim was to prevent any sheer superior brute force humans from attacking each other's ex expropriate expropriating each other's property and tearing each other's to shreds. The price each had to pay to attain this measure of peace and order was the sacrifice some of his freedom and his natural desire to possess anything for himself. Like Epicurus, Hobbes was a hedonist. Pleasure was the motivating principle for him too. It was the naturally human desire for pleasure in a form of peace, harmony, and a longer life that led him to set up the state. The state then enacted various laws to make humans behave in accordance with the laws of nature. Civil law would codify them in more precise and relevant forms proper to each nation. The state would need to be invested with all power and authority so that none would dare to challenge it. Then only would it be able to curb the natural urge of humans to rape, loot, and tyrannize. Power is thus a necessary constituent of law. In effect, for Hobbes, action are bad because they are forbidden, not the other way round. The source of moral rightness or wrongness, the criterion of the criterion of morality is what is the law says, whether it be divine law or positive civil law. The ethical teachings of Hobbes have been qualified in various ways. Some call it ethical egoism in in as much as it is based on the allegedly natural and reasonable human urge to seek pleasure and self preservation. Others prefer to dub it social utilitarianism because it grounds law on the desire of human to live in peace and harmony with each other. A third view is that it is a kind of moral positivism because it posits divine power or God's will as the ultimate ground of moral good, as the sole criterion of morality. Jeremy Bentham saw the ethical issue from a moral, individualistic point of view. His argument was that since society is made up of individuals, it would be quite in order to view the whole subject from the perspective of individual utility seeking as the basis of ethics. A good law for Bentham is one in which utility is effected, resulting in pleasure or happiness to the party whose interest is concerned. Drawing apparently on Hobbes, he takes it as a clear datum that the seeking of pleasure and the avoidance of pain are the chief human motives in decision making. Yet the emphasizes he is not speaking merely of sensual pleasure, but also that which arises from intellectual study and benevolent. Most human beings, however, do not know precisely how to apply this standard in daily life, especially when it is a matter of making an option between multiple choices. To this end, he offers a specific calculus as a guideline for the common man in his decision making process. First of all, he observes it would seem reasonable that he should choose that action which would bring about the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of persons for the longest stretch of time. He then proposes seven norms to help one in making such a measurement. It is all a matter of focusing on the pleasure concern and checking out its intensity, duration, certainty, nearness, fecundity, fecundity, its capacity to include other pleasurable sensation, purity, its freedom from any admixture of unpleasant sensations, and inclusiveness. The number of people affected by it. Bentham widens the meaning of pleasure to involve certain altruistic and unselfish elements. Be that as it may, the stress he put on the quantitative dimension of pleasure almost begs for a misunderstanding. Immanuel Kant, the sage of Königsberg, was to have a major impact on the development of contemporary Western thought. The second volume of his famous philosophical trilogy of the Critics was devoted to new and revolutionary insight into ethics. Right at the onset of his critique of practical reason, he rejects all such system that is based on a heteronomous source, that is, on some principle or norm outside the human person. Were we to maintain such a point of view, he tells us in effect, if a person had to reject that norm, and then there would be no basis helping him or her to be a moral person. Thus he begins by noting that in us there are not only some priori, hence universal and necessary principles of speculative knowledge in us, but similar principles of practical knowledge, in as much as there are a priori. They constitute an internal norms of morality in man, autonomous principles. For Kant, the only thing that can be called good without qualification is a goodwill. All other goods such as health, wealth, and long life can be used for bad end. They are only relatively good. Now, what precisely is a good will? A will which acts for the sake of duty alone and no other motive is a good will. That is perhaps Kant's way of telling us that a good will does not act out of self-interest. Be that as it may, the kind of language he uses has given his doctrine a very rigorous appearance. This duty is rooted in the moral law itself, which in turn is manifest moral consciousness, a prior synthetic practical judgment. Now universality is the very form of the moral law, so once again a certain rigidity is to be expected of its categorical demand. Allowing the possibility of exceptions would do violence to this universal form of the normal law. The first general formulation of the basic categorical imperative is for Kant: I must act such that my way of acting could become a universal procedure. There are other formations popularized by Kant, especially never treat a person merely as a means. What they always enshrine some kind of universality as constitutive of its very form. He derived three postulates from the undeniable fact of the categorical imperative: human freedom, the immortality of the soul, and the existence of God. This is no contradiction of what he had maintained in an earlier critique. There he held that one cannot prove these truths from pure reason, whereas in the second critique he says that the practical reason can and must postulate postulate. John Stuart Mill (1806 to 1873), author of a treatise entitled Utilitarianism. Mill was even more direct and explicit that Bentham in holding that utility or the greatest happiness principle should be the foundation of morals. However, he seemed to widen his criterion to involve not just the happiness of mankind but rather of all sentient being. But he went on to add further refinement and precision to Bentham's initial approach. First, he stressed that there is also a qualitative difference between pleasures and not just a quantitative one. Next, he suggested that what the individual seek is not his personal or private happiness, but the common happiness of all. He even endeavors to give a rational basis to the pleasure principle by appealing to the conscientious feeling of mankind, that is the fact that everybody would say so. Emile Durkheim, 1858 to 1917, a French positivist whose thinking was affected by the rise of natural sciences. He is also held as the father of sociology. One of his key writings is the elementary forms of religious experience, in which he attempted to give a materialistic positivist explanations even for religion from his study of totemism, which he held to be the originary form of our religions. He concluded that the gods were nothing more than the tribal society conceived symbolically. From this, he concluded that religious rites, worship, and dogma were nothing but various ways and means to make people accept and submit themselves to the laws and customs of their closed tribal group. This same approach he also employed to morality too. Moral laws then are nothing but positive laws enacted by a given society to ensure its stability and preservation. In other words, the norm of morality is plainly and simply concrete positive law. It would be more accurate to call it sociological positivism, as it is grounded on human, social rather than individual or private law. Durkheim was well brought on the link between human social consciousness. Durkheim has well brought out the link between human social consciousness and moral development. However, he is loath to admit against the views of even some of his later disciples that there seems to be a common underlying structure, some kind of common principle at work everywhere, that is the basis of the admitted Diversity of moral setups. Again, if morality is primarily a matter of following the crowd, how do we account for the emergence of radical thinkers who openly and drainedly rejected and challenged the existence modes of a given society? Let us sum up. It is quite common to find ethos defined It is quite common to find ethos defined, but Paul W. Taylor does in an excellent introduction to this discipline. Ethics may be defined as philosophical inquiry into the nature and grounds of morality. We do not, however, find this approach very illuminating, for as we have seen, morals is nothing but the Latin equivalent of the more Greek terms ethics. If we try to avoid this uh, item per item repetitive definition by saying it studies the goodness or badness or the rightness or wrongness of human actions. This does not get us much further, because as we have equally seen, terms like good or bad, right or wrong are is skeptical to many understandings, and so possible confusions are not quite dispelled. That That is why we try to make clear in precisely what sense that they result in someone being better personal or all round, and not just in some restricted sphere, a good singer or student or tennis player. So our definition of ethics would run something as follows. Ethics is a branch of philosophy which studies human actions from the point of view of their enabling a person to become more fully human, more fully alive. We can therefore say that ethics is that branch of philosophy which studies what makes a person truly liberated. Now, any worthwhile discussion of ethics sooner or later confronts us with the phrase human acts. We should pause for a moment to underline the meaning and significance of what these words imply. They are actually the legacy of old scholastic thought and still relevant today. We must need to distinguish between what could be called act of humans and human acts. The Latin maintains the word play more neatly. Uh, actus humanus and actus hominis. A human act is an act put forward by a person acting in fully capacity as human, out of full awareness and freedom. After all, knowledge and free choices are what characterize humans as humans. Only when someone does something knowingly and freely can he she be held accountable for that act, and accordingly he praised or blamed for it. If someone were unknowingly to drink a cup of poison tea, no one could accuse him or her of attempted suicide. One might say that what he or she had done was objectively a suicidal act of itself. It would bring about the person's death or serious illness if medical interventions were not sought immediately, but subjectively he or she could not be blamed for the act. This example should also make us realize that we cannot behave as if only subjective morality were important, since that is the area where praise or blame, moral accountability comes in. If the action were objectively wrong in itself, it would have some bad effects on agent psychologically or physiologically. Even if he or she did not do it full knowledge and full consent, to use the time honored formula, ethics then is more concerned with actions done as a result of knowledge and free choice. Only such actions make us better or worse persons all round. Act of humans, that is, actions done unintentionally, unknowingly, including doing in objectively wrong action while not knowing such an act is wrong, would not affect one all round as a person. Thank you.